Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of the Clearly Cloud podcast. I'm your host, Sean Spicer, and I'm flying solo until our guest arrives this week. So get ready for a little bit of cats away shenanigans. Our guest this week is Ed Britan, Microsoft's Senior Director and Policy Counsel for AI and Privacy. Following up on the legislative bent of last week's show with Chris Payota, former Director of Science and Technology for the FBI. But hey, don't worry. Next week, we're getting away from policy, and we're going to be looking at the history of the cloud with Bruce, a.k.a. Bruce Wyman, the sysop of the Grotto BPS, one of the longest-running and most influential BBSs on the West Coast, back in the 80s and 90s. And that one's bound to get weird, but not as weird as this news week. So let's just jump onto that.
5, 4, 3, 2, bringing you some news.
All right, so I always say it's been a fast week for news, big week for news, slow week for news. This has been an outstandingly weird week for news. Let's just kick right into TikTok. So back on August 6th, President Trump issued this executive order that would have effectively shut down WhatsApp and TikTok in the U.S. And both were supposed to shut down today, September 20th. Then there was a bidding war. Microsoft and Oracle, even Walmart jumped in. And then China banned the export of the algorithm, including in their international trade acts, recommendation of personalized information services based on data analysis were export controlled, meaning that maybe a U.S. company couldn't buy this stuff. So Microsoft made a bid. Their owners said, no, thanks. Oracle got the deal on Thursday. Friday morning, the U.S. Commerce Department nixed it, and then ByteDance filed a lawsuit. Then on Saturday, the president approved it, with Oracle becoming a cloud partner and a 12.5% owner, with Walmart taking a 7.5% stake. TikTok's parent company ByteDance will continue to own 80% of the company. So a lot of people are saying, well, I like the New York Times headline, which said there's no there, that this actually isn't an acquisition. The information's still going to be moving. But meanwhile, this entire time, WeChat has been impacted as well. And WeChat is a chat app. It's like Google Hangouts, text messages. It's just a chat platform. But in China, it's one of the main platforms for e-commerce, for sending money back and forth between individuals. It's an incredibly useful platform. And how that matters in the US is that with Facebook banned in China and so many other US tech companies banned in China, WeChat is a very useful way for Chinese Americans to communicate with their families back home because they have to get past the Great Firewall. And if WeChat gets taken down, then there's going to be problems. So early Sunday, a judge blocked the deplatforming of WeChat, saying their First Amendment claims and their lawsuits had merit. So we're back where we were 3 weeks ago. WeChat staying, TikTok staying. There we go. And so apparently in this trade war, I don't know, ByteDance actually sought out Oracle for this, knowing that co-founder Larry Ellison is a major Trump contributor and CEO Safra Catz served on Trump's transition team. So this was definitely had some interesting nuances. Not quite sure where that goes, but I think we're going to be watching this for a while. But the one thing that's really important to note is that Oracle was founded back in 1975 from a CIA contract. It's even named after it, Project Oracle, which was a mass storage project that Larry Ellison was a freelancer working on at the time. It's also interesting to note that I think Oracle has sued the government more than anybody and been in fights with the government more than anybody. And they were actually banned from bidding on GSA contracts after a 2011 False Claims Act settlement for overcharging the government from 1998 to 2006. So 8 years, and that settlement was $200 million. And then there's this Jedi contract, which went to Microsoft. There's some fighting from Amazon. Oracle really didn't even have a place to come in for the contract, but they've been working as gadflies and working to stop this deal for a while, hoping that they could get it. Now, what's also going on in Washington, and I've got to give like a big hands up to everybody who worked to get this passed. On Wednesday, the House passed an IoT security bill, an Internet of Things security bill. And this has been making its way through the halls of Washington since 2017. Now, this bill requires NIST to issue guidance on securing IoT devices and will restrict companies selling IoT to the government. And normally what happens when there is a government regulation, that causes downstream results on the consumer side. Because if I'm going to make something that I'm going to sell to the government, well, I'm just going to go ahead and make the same thing for the consumer side, and those protections will be there. And the big issue with this is that home IoT devices, from cameras to doorbells to baby monitors, have given rise to these immense botnets used for distributed denial of service attacks. It's so much easier for me to say DDoS, like those that recently took down the Australian Stock Exchange, and also a notable attack where hackers were able to exfiltrate a Las Vegas hotel's guest records by hacking a thermostat controller in an aquarium. And this also gives way to the Christmas Day attacks on the PlayStation and Xbox networks that usually bring those things down, griefing people who bought new devices. Now, a huge player in IoT is ARM. And the biggest tech news outside of weird TikTok stuff is that chip manufacturer NVIDIA, who we talked about a week or so ago about releasing their new GPUs, these amazing graphics cards, have agreed on a deal for $40 billion in cash and stock to buy ARM, which is one of the biggest chip, well, the biggest chip designer in the world. And this is the second biggest tech acquisition in history. So back in 2016, Dell purchased EMC for $67 billion. But this blows away Microsoft buying LinkedIn. This is a huge deal. But more than the money, it's that what ARM is, and if you don't know ARM, you should. It's in your phone. It's in almost every major piece of consumer tech, from Android to iPhone. It's in the Nintendo Switch. It's in Arduinos. It's in Raspberry Pis. And the press release that the CEO of NVIDIA put out really talked about how this focus is on artificial intelligence and IoT. Now, ARM is in 90% of the smartphone market. And the thing is, they don't make any of their own chips. Instead, they license their designs to companies like Intel, AMD, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA. And a lot of this is built on this ecosystem they built with thousands of partners and vendors and manufacturers who've traditionally relied on ARM not being a competitor. So when your biggest competitor buys the designer of your chips, this could cause a huge shakeup in terms of chip manufacturing. Now, the deal has to be approved by 4 countries, unions. So it has to be approved by the US, the UK, the EU, and China. 20% of ARM's business is in China. And given the recent history of US-China tech clashes, China isn't happy. With NVIDIA and ARM saying the deal will likely take 18 months to complete, this story won't be over soon. We might have a resolution on the whole TikTok WeChat thing by then. But let's get out of that international regulatory environment for a second, and let's talk about Project Natick. So in 2018, Microsoft launched a project for throwing data centers in the water. And they submerged a data center into the seabed off of Scotland's Orkney Islands. It's powered entirely by renewable energy, and they just pulled it out of the water after 2 years of operating, just being a standard data center underwater. And it was powered entirely by renewable energy, and it wound up being 8 times more reliable than standard data centers, which engineers are saying it's probably due to the fact that there were no humans bumping into things, and that they replaced the normal air that you would have in a data center that, has to have humans walking around bumping into things. They replaced that with dry nitrogen, which doesn't come with the corrosion issues of oxygen. So they've got air samples. They're taking this whole thing apart and they're figuring out what worked, what didn't. And this has a huge potential for boosting edge computing and in getting data centers closer to customers. So I'm really excited to watch this. I had a conversation this weekend that was technically off the record with a person at the Surfrider Foundation who's a little bit concerned about the heat that's generated by data centers being thrown into the ocean because it does cause the growth of algae. So a lot to digest there, but congratulations, Microsoft, on Project Natick. This looked super cool. Another interesting story comes out of Germany. Turns out ransomware killed its first person. Well, maybe killed its first person. So we've got the first fatal ransomware. So a Dusseldorf hospital had a ransomware attack that forced it to close its accident and emergency departments on September 10th. A woman got brought there and then was being transferred to another hospital because they couldn't handle anybody coming in. And when she was in transference to the other hospital, she died en route. And this was based on a CVE, a critical vulnerability that was released in 2019. The hospital says they patched it according to recommendations from the German government. But the ransom demand was addressed to a different organization. And when police contacted those responsible for the ransom request, they just turned over the keys, probably realizing, we're probably in some deep water here. So really an interesting story to watch, and just more proof that the cloud affects everything every day, from work and play to life and death. But you know what? Let's get on to our guest.
4, 3, 2, 1, having some fun with guests.
And today, we're joined by Ed Britan, the Senior Director and Policy Counsel for AI and Privacy at Microsoft. And we're going to talk a little bit about the regulations that are being moved forward and approaches to regulation around AI and privacy. How are you doing today, Ed?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me, Sean.
It's wonderful to have you. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you wound up working in this space?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Ed Britan. I've spent a lot of years working on privacy and technology policy. First 7 years at Alston & Burden, Washington, D.C., working on a range of issues related to the federal government. Always I've had an interest in tech and data privacy. In my time at the firm, I liked where Microsoft stood on those issues. They were always pushing the ball, moving the ball forward, and definitely a thought leader on these issues. So I moved to Seattle from DC, worked in their headquarters for over 6 years on global privacy, legal, and policy issues. Leaving in 2014, and that was certainly a fascinating time to work on these issues globally. The GDPR was proposed, passed, and implemented. The General Data Protection Regulation, that's Europe's privacy law. The California Consumer Privacy Act went from initiative to becoming the first comprehensive privacy law in the U.S. We saw lots of other notable proposals around regulating privacy and technology. And we've seen significant bills proposed at the federal level as well in D.C. In March, in the midst of the pandemic, I moved my family back to our home in D.C. I was hoping I'd make it in time to see the Nats banner unveiling, but in this COVID time, I bought myself a really gaudy championship ring as a consolation for missing out on that. and now here in DC, I'm focusing on AI and privacy. Still, from a more U.S. policy perspective, it's a fascinating time to be working on AI. There's a lot going on globally. There's much the U.S. needs to do, and that we'd recommend they do to remain a world leader, both with respect to development of the technology and being a thought leader on policy. I think if we've learned anything from the experience of the General Data Protection Regulation and the work on privacy, it's that governments do industry no favors by staying on the sidelines on these important global issues. So definitely would encourage the U.S. government to lean in and engage on these huge societal issues.
So technologically, where do you think we are with AI at this point?
I mean, it's amazing, how rapidly technology has advanced. Just thinking of the pandemic, and sometimes I think about how difficult the pandemic would be. It's already difficult. Don't get me wrong. I have 3 kids, 2 of which are in homeschool right now, virtually. But how much more difficult it would be if this were 2010 as opposed to 2020? I mean, what would we have done without the cloud computing and document information sharing technologies like Teams, which we're using currently, or if staying in our houses, how bad would that have been without the entertainment options that we have through the many various streaming services and gaming services, none of which would have existed just 10 years ago, or maybe even just 5 years ago. So it's really amazing how connected we can be without even leaving our house. And that's thanks to advancements in technology, and AI is a big part of that. And, like I said, it's amazing how new these technologies are. When I left DC for Microsoft just in 2014, a lot of my non-tech savvy friends here in town, they didn't think of it as a cloud company on the rise because they were still in the world of thinking of Microsoft as, Word and Excel and PowerPoint and
servers.
Now, and server. And now we're so far beyond just cloud adoption. The cloud is now just generally accessible. And, as you know, this has made vast amounts of computation power and data storage available to everyone without the need for huge investments in hardware. So all of that is going to continue to fuel advances in machine learning and algorithms.
And you made that mention of having kids at home that are homeschooling at the moment or distance learning. And I have a 10-year-old and I feel digitally savvy. However, my son has jumped into this head first and has created online groups of friends and is able to stay connected. And when you think about what it would be like 10 years ago versus what it is today, but also 10 years ago, we had a much different regulatory space within government, within the laws that were there. There was no GDPR. There were no major privacy regulations. We're still regulated quite a bit by a lot of old policy. Where is policy at this point for AI?
Yeah, I think, it's important for AI to be trusted and because it needs to be used because AI runs on data and people aren't going to use technology if they don't trust the technology, and then there'll be less data to fuel the technology and improve it and to ensure it has the outcomes we want it to have. So I think that there's a huge need to advance, the laws when it comes to how they regulated AI. I think at Microsoft, we believe it's inevitable that AI law will emerge over time. It's also important, however, before devising new regulations or laws, for there to be clarity and evidence shared about the fundamental issues that must be addressed. Additionally, we would encourage, governments to be proactive in clarifying, as you mentioned, existing laws that existed before these current technologies were already available in policy to specify how AI can and should be utilized under those existing legal regimes. So in many instances, those existing laws are already applicable and apply to AI services, and we just need clarity as to how they apply and how we can use, these new technologies in line with those existing laws. And then there's also some particularly impactful implementations of, new technology in AI, such as with respect to facial recognition, where regulation and new regulations are absolutely appropriate now, and companies like mine are calling for that. When it comes to existing law, I think the uncertainty as to how current laws and regulations apply to AI is preventing many companies from leveraging these solutions in ways that could produce better and more accurate results more efficiently. This barrier is to adoption is impairing the ability for AI to develop, which is limiting the quality of AI services that can support the pressing issues of our time. Obviously, we haven't seen the U.S. harness technology to the same degree to address COVID-19, the pandemic, or the huge racial equity issues that we're seeing in this country. And I think a lot of that could be unlocked, and we could really unlock the value of data if there were clear rules of the road so that companies knew how they could operate in the space and utilize data to address these issues.
So Ed, how does somebody distinguish, maybe not just somebody, but, what's the difference between, there's the you're going to code up an application and it learns a pattern, whether it's a e-commerce shopping app, just starting kind of simple there. And, it has logic, it detects things, but, it's not quote unquote learning. But then you slap something out. How does either a consumer or even a business to say, well, is my app or is my technology AI, or is it just, doing good at crawling some data and giving me something? How does somebody know the difference?
I mean, it's a good question. I think, and there's lots of different definitions of AI that I've seen out there in the world that, I've been in many, discussion groups about the subject of what AI is and isn't. And those conversations alone could take hours. I think the important thing to think about is it's the automation. And that's really at the heart of the regulation. And it's this idea of when the technology is learning on its own and making decisions on its own, which is why I think explainability is such a big issue. And why, the laws that exist, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and other laws of that kind that require an explanation of why a decision turned out a particular way are particularly relevant for our customers that want to use these new technologies that are more automated, that use more machine learning, and have less human engagement. I think human engagement is really important, and that's a key element of the law as well, to prevent these decisions from being made entirely absent human empathy and human decision making. But I think that's really the crux of it, is the more automation and this idea that we're getting away from human control, where the regulation is most important.
Yeah, because I think that was part of what I was thinking, was distinguishing what it is. Because if you can't define what it is, it's hard to regulate it, right? And I think that's part of it. Then you can regulate it. And then how do consumers know that, if they're using some application, the favorite one, and that way everybody talks about right now, like TikTok, it isn't, you don't start up the app and it says, powered by AI, but it's there. How do consumers know that versus I just go to a website to do something? And is that even important for them to look for and to consider?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, the lines blur as to when it's AI and when it's not AI. And I don't know how important that distinction is. I think the important thing is to protect the data that's used in these systems, and to protect how these systems are used, so they're not used in unpredictable ways. And I think, it starts, with a comprehensive privacy or data protection law that regulates the data itself. And then more so, I think that can get us a long way. I think, we've seen, we mentioned the GDPR in Europe really, I think, create a good baseline for protection that has fostered trust in Europe. And I think that's important. And then beyond that, I think, the clarification of how you can meet the Fair Credit Reporting Act's obligations to provide consumers with rights of explanation and to correct credit decisions and things of that nature. Some clarification as to how that can be achieved when you're using automated tools, call them AI, call them, just online services that involve automation. But the key, I think, is explaining, what problems we're trying to avoid or what solutions we're trying to create. Here it's the explainability and how they can achieve that. And I think there's really good ways to provide explainability that exist in the world today. And the question that I think policymakers have to determine is which of those can they point to as enabling companies to move forward with the technology, whether it be like counterfactual testing or the various other mechanisms that exist for promoting explainability.
Now, you're talking about managing the privacy of data, and I liked earlier that you mentioned the CCPA. And a lot of people speculate that the CCPA is going to eventually become kind of the scaffolding for a broader federal Data Privacy Act. But how do you feel about that? Do you think that might be the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, CCP, the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, which would and now there's a new initiative in California, the California Consumer Privacy Rights Act, that's going to be on the November ballot. But are leading the country when it comes to comprehensive privacy requirements. And I think CCPA was a landmark law. It was the first comprehensive, and when I say comprehensive, I mean broadly regulating personal information law to pass in the United States, which provides that important baseline protection that I was talking about. But why should, California is the fifth biggest market on earth. So California's passing a law is certainly impactful. But why should Californians have protections that the rest of Americans don't have? At Microsoft, we provided the core rights that exist under the California law to all Americans. But in the absence of a law that requires everyone to do that, a lot of folks won't get to access those rights from a lot of different companies. So we think it's important. And I think, we've seen that consumers are demanding it and individuals are demanding it in the US. So I do think that, it was the CCPA was a first step. It provided these core rights. I think folks in California recognized that there had to be obligations on companies as well. And that's what the CPRA initiative really adds to CCPA. And I think at the federal level, the states are the laboratories for democracy, and they should look to what California has done, what other states are doing. For instance, Washington State introduced a Washington Privacy Act that also would have been a comprehensive privacy law similar to CCPA and CPRA, with the corporate obligations included. That would also be, work well in combination with what exists globally. And I do think sooner rather than later, we will see a law at the federal level.
I hope so. And this feeds into what you said earlier about advancing existing laws and figuring out how it applies to artificial intelligence. And in the comments on the Office of Management and Budget, when they requested comments for their regulation of artificial intelligence applications, Microsoft talked about adapting the existing FDA frameworks as well as the health data interoperability rules. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like moving into the realm of AI?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, health interoperability is super important right now, especially given that we're in the pandemic. And Microsoft raised that because we support the Department of Health and Human Services rules that make it easier for patients to access and share their medical information. These rule changes should improve competition and give power to patients to control their healthcare data, including through a range of new applications that will include embedded AI solutions that promise to improve health outcomes and enable patients to take greater control of their healthcare experiences and do more, independently and harness technology to promote better health outcomes. I think this is important for addressing the current crisis, obviously. And I think, at the same time, it's important that these goals be accomplished in a manner that protects privacy and imposes transparency, disclosure, and accountability obligations on these application developers and other third parties that may have access to this data. That's the only way that we can establish the level of trust in these mechanisms that is necessary for them to achieve maximum effectiveness. It all goes back to, we need to instill trust so that these things are used so that they can be effective. And, this can, as I've mentioned already, could be accomplished in large part through passage of comprehensive baseline privacy legislation along the lines of what we've seen introduced or proposed in California, Washington State, including some bills at the federal level as well, especially out of the Senate Commerce Committee, are really strong proposals. And it would be great to see one of those get across the finish line at the federal level. But I don't think that we should, these rules are needed now. So anything that could be done, whether through Congress or the agencies, to ensure that these health interoperability, rules are that these things are utilized and these applications are utilized to promote trust would be great. And, what we think these new rules should do is, things like ensuring that patients can control their health data, obtain a copy of their data and fix any errors. Further, they should restrict the ability of third parties to access, use, and sell the data that they process on behalf of patients, particularly for unexpected secondary purposes. That's always a huge trust issue.
And for unexpected secondary purposes, there have been a number of stories in the last couple of weeks with the contact tracing in the EU, where you have workers at retail venues, at restaurants that are taking the COVID trace information and using it to contact customers for amorous intent, if you will. Now, what I find is interesting is how Privacy fits into AI so well because with the privacy regulations, we're regulating the data that AI manages. But there are things where the algorithm itself would need to be managed. And wouldn't that be the case with facial recognition?
That's right. I think at Microsoft, we have several principles that we think are important for AI, privacy being one of them and being a key principle. But another key principle is fairness and ensuring that these technologies are used in a way that's unbiased and non-discriminatory, which is especially tricky when you're dealing with data sets that may have underlying biases. And so I think it is important both to have a baseline rule, but then with certain technologies, especially like facial recognition, it's important to also have protections beyond that to ensure that the technology is deployed in a way that is fair and doesn't promote discrimination.
Now, a term in Microsoft comments that I found interesting was the idea of evidence-based policymaking. For our listeners, can you explain what that is?
Sure. It's the idea that by collecting information on best practices and taking the time to do that, to identify what's working and what isn't at the agency level in the government, and then sharing it at the interagency level, that can help broaden awareness of potential risks, promote best practices, and further efforts in terms of identifying unintended consequences that aren't yet covered by existing regulations, identifying where additional guidance, modifications to policy frameworks, or new regulations may be needed. So it's just that thoughtful approach, fact-based approach, and information sharing approach to generate the best possible policy making to enable, establish more appropriate policy frameworks while reducing the risk of regulatory actions that could adversely impact innovation.
So you've mentioned there that the sharing of information and best practices between agencies, and there was that discussion of encouraging a culture of data sharing, but that extends beyond just the public sector, right? That extends into the private sector as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a great point. And it's so important to unblock the data silos that presently exist, especially in government, but also in the private sector. I mean, this is going to help to address the issues of our time and more specifically to ensure that folks are using AI responsibly. So there have to be rules of the road for this data sharing. An example of private sector data being leveraged to improve policymaking at Microsoft, we've used our analytics of anonymized data that we collected to evaluate the performance and security of our software and services to improve broadband access policy. Specifically in 2018, our analyses of this data showed that the number of people who have access to the internet at broadband speeds is much lower than broadband access data reported by the Federal Communications Commission in its broadband map. As independent studies have shown that there is a direct correlation between broadband access and economic growth. Accurate data on connectivity has a real impact on well-being, particularly at this time of COVID-19 where so much is happening online, as we've discussed. So in response to our work and the information we shared, bipartisan mapping bills were passed into law, and the FCC adopted new rules for more granular broadband map collection. So an example of how we leveraged our knowledge and data, hopefully to make things a little bit better and improve the nation's ability to address the huge issues around connectivity, given that the digital divide is such a stark issue the country faces in this crisis.
Oh, absolutely. And that's also a sterling example of bias in a data set.
Absolutely.
So how does regulation encourage innovation and encourage adoption of AI?
Yeah, I think it's, companies need certainty. They need clear rules of the road. And I think, especially a lot of our big customers are very risk averse and they don't want to wade into things that could get them into trouble, both with laws that it's unclear how the law applies to this new technology or just in general with respect to public relations and customer service. So I think by providing clear rules for the road, by explaining how existing laws apply to these new technologies, that's going to foster utilization. I think, for example, the FTC recently issued guidance stating that AI can be used in a manner that is compliant with the Fair Credit Reporting Act. which is great that they could be used in compliance with FCRA. But they've also, by issuing that guidance, they've highlighted that FCRA and other laws apply to AI services. And what's needed next, I think, is guidance and instruction as to more granularly how that compliance can be achieved, and that will really help alleviate some of the concerns of customers and those looking to utilize these services to take that step and actually put them into use. The Fair Credit Reporting Act is not the only U.S. law which requires this type of explanation that I think is of concern to folks that might want to use AI technologies. Is also the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Fair Housing Act, which provide individuals the right to be informed of the specific reasons underlying a decision and the ability to seek redress. So from a policy perspective, this is just one example of how the U.S. government could explain how this can be done in compliance with those existing laws. And I think that would really both promote the use of these technologies in a way that's compliant and protects individuals, but it would also encourage more companies to actually take that step and move forward with the confidence they can do so in compliance with the law.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting point. I mean, there seems that as a company, you almost think that there's two paths. Maybe there's a third. You kind of walk on the line, but there's ones that say, we're building a product. AI is great, and we're just going to go for it. I don't see any really clear definition of regulations. So I'm just going to go for it. And if they start to regulate, then I'll adapt. But that could be harmful. The other is, well, I think I could really leverage it in this way, but it's not really clear. So maybe I have to hold back, maybe do a little bit, but not really innovate as much as I'd like to, because I'm so risk averse of, impacting the rest of the business that you could have. So I think that what you're calling out is kind of help bring those two parts together to make it clear so you can innovate and do things and make sure it's not harmful and follow the law. And at the same time, consumers would feel better about it and get better services from it.
That's exactly right. Because in the absence of that clarity, what you're going to have is you're going to have the former types of companies that you mentioned that are going to move forward because they see the opportunity, and the responsible, companies that are more concerned about doing the right thing may stay out of the arena. So I do think that, we want to encourage those responsible, large established companies, not just large established companies, but just the companies that are more risk averse and more responsible. We want to encourage them to use these technologies and develop them as well. So I think that, but these companies aren't going to act until they feel confident they can do so in a way that satisfies the law.
Right. And I think a lot of companies learned their lesson with GDPR and in a way with CCPA. Well, honestly, with any regulation where the early movers within a vertical or an industry that adopt this technology and they have everything set up and running, and then the regulation appears and now they have to retool everything. They have to adapt their practices, which often comes at incredible expense. And one of the things you mentioned, and I don't want to get into the technical side of things here, I really want to stay focused on policy, but when you were talking about the housing agencies where they need to expose how a decision is made. This is one of the problems with AI, is that AIs tend to become black boxes. How is that being handled and even thought about?
Yeah, I think that's and there's been countless academic papers written about this subject. It's because it's just such a fascinating problem. But I think there are ways to promote explainability of algorithmic decision making by encouraging companies to give the users of the technology meaningful information about the inputs that affect the decisions, the ways in which algorithms are selected and used, and how algorithmic decisions are made. And there's a lot of ways that companies can do that, including through concepts such as data sheets for data sets, which is the idea that AI systems are best understood by evaluating the underlying training data, the process used to train the model, and the resulting model. And it's a project that a group of Microsoft researchers is seeking to advance as a common framework for documenting and explaining key characteristics of the underlying data sets. Another example would be through counterfactuals, and our researchers are also doing great work on using counterfactual explanations to generate explanations for individual outputs or predictions by identifying the smallest change to the input features that would cause the model or system to produce a desired output or prediction. For example,
wow.
So it's cool. So it doesn't give you, So, for example, the counterfactual explanation might help an applicant identify the smallest change she could make to her financial circumstances to qualify for a loan, for instance. So that's obviously really, important information that'll help explain, how the decision, the impetus for the decision, which, I think we should be encouraging, because that increases an understanding of these algorithms in a way that's really helpful to individuals.
Wow. And I've got so many different ideas where that would be useful on the personal level, particularly the business level, but just on a personal level, that would be outstanding. So where is regulation on AI now? Is there any AI specific regulation or can we expect? I believe it was in William Gibson's Neuromancer, the Turing laws, where AIs are going to have digital shotguns wired to their head. Is there AI specific legislation moving forward?
There is, and we're seeing some move forward now in terms of like promoting in the U.S. Promoting ethical use of AI and things of that nature. Globally, I think that we're seeing the most forward-thinking proposals are again seeming to come out of Europe, and that's why it's so important, I think, to encourage U.S. engagement on these issues as well, because it should be, I think, a global conversation. And so I'd really hopeful that these regulations coming. It's needed. There's ideas out there for how to ensure trust and ensure fairness and ensure the technology is used appropriately. And I think it really demands, a multilateral, multi-stakeholder conversation. And so to be part of that conversation, as a country, we need to engage. And I think, I think the U.S. will do that. And I think we're starting to see, bills move forward now in the U.S. that makes me optimistic that there's an understanding of the gravity of taking action here, as opposed to staying on the sidelines. There had been this train of thought that not regulating or deregulation is to the advantage of industry, which I think is sometimes true, but not always. I mean, there's also the instances, certainly the U.S. government's staying on the sideline didn't give us a leadership position with respect to what the rules of the road would be for privacy regulation. But I don't think, it's not that, and now the rules of the road are what the rules of the road are. And I think that the standard's been set globally, and that's the environment that we operate in. And I think it's important for the U.S. to engage on AI to ensure that the U.S. voice is heard in this space.
Technology has accelerated and the rate of innovation has accelerated. And one of the things about AI is that when AI starts moving and analyzing, it is incredibly fast. And that's almost a direct opposite to when you hear about, stories like what David told us in our first episode, the amount of time it took to get the Cloud Act passed. And it really is a race. So for our listeners, Ed, what can they do if they're concerned about this?
I would say, especially when it comes to privacy law in the U.S., which we're way overdue for having a comprehensive privacy law here in the U.S., I would say, that's the baseline protection. And I think protecting the data is something that it's clear how it has to be done. The global standard's been set. There are now U.S. proposals and even the law in California that are very much interoperable with the global standard. And I think, regardless of the model that actually moves forward, I think the most important thing is for a comprehensive privacy law that protects data to move forward. And so I would encourage folks to let it be heard that Americans want privacy protection. And there have been recent studies by Pew and KPMG and others that indicate that this is the case. In fact, a recent KPMG report indicates that 9 out of 10 Americans view privacy as a human right. And I think, give it, if the public demands it strongly enough, folks in DC will hear that. And I think we'll move forward. We have really good proposals now at the federal level in DC out of the Senate Commerce Committee from Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Cantwell, and others comprehensive proposals that would stack up well against the global standard, and I think arguably even improve upon the global standard, move privacy law forward in the United States. There's obviously issues, political issues and other issues standing in the way, but I think perhaps we can get folks to the table to work those things out if the public lets their legislators know that this is an important issue that they care about.
Wow, that is a lot to digest. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us. We appreciate it greatly, and we look forward to having you on again someday.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you. You know, my family's heard all this from me before, and they don't they're not as interested as you guys have seemed to be. So I'm always happy to come and talk about these issues that I find really interesting. And so thank you for having me and giving me that opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Somewhere out inside